Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this parallel thematic session on environment, climate change, and food systems. My name is Tafadzwa Mabaudi. I'm with the National Water Management Institute, University of KwaZulu-Natal, and LSHTM. I wear multi. So welcome to this session. I think even during the week is the need for integrated solutions, these global challenges at multiple scales because they affect people from household up to a global level. So we're looking at multiple scales. What we also need to appreciate is the interlinkage between diets, climate change, biodiversity, food systems, and health, and how the various decisions that we each make at a household level, at a food plate level, link up into the challenges that we are trying to address at a global level. There is a need to co-create and co-develop knowledge and solutions, working with the public and private partner, sustainable ways of transforming food systems and delivering sustainable diets that are healthy for people and planet. And we need to do this in a contextualized and regionally differentiated way that takes into appreciation the heterogeneity of landscapes, people, culture, and environments. So essentially, we need to understand that it's not a silver bullet solution, and it's not a one size fit all solution, but we need multiple solutions and multiple perspectives that inform these solutions. And in coming up with those type of integrated solutions, it means we need to work in a transdisciplinary manner that brings together a range of actors across academia and research, the public sector, private sector, and communities as we start developing these solutions. And we need to step outside of our own comfort zones and often be pushed to work at the boundaries of our knowledge. I've spent the last 10 years working at the boundaries of my knowledge. I'm a crop physiologist by training. The thing I understand the most is crop responses to stress, but I haven't worked on crop responses to stress in the longest time. Most of my work has been at the interface of water, environment, food systems, and people. So we need to face that discomfort of operating at the boundaries of our discipline because it's at those boundaries, at those intersections, and at those points of convergence that we can actually innovate and come up with new knowledge. If I'd stayed within my disciplinary space, I would have had a very comfortable career, but there would have been very limited innovation. Because by the time I finished my PhD, I was familiar with all the fundamentals in the space. So I'd have just been applying. But when you move towards the boundaries, that is where there is space for innovation and new knowledge creation. So I'm hoping that the talks that we have today will showcase some of this knowledge that is being generated at these boundaries of knowledge and some of the solutions that we need to be considering as we go forward. So we've got a very interesting lineup of speakers that we've got three of them in person. We've got Anjali in person. We've got Anjali from CCDC coming from India. We've got Claudia in LSHTM, as well as Elena Martinez joining us on the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know you are just back from lunch. My name is Anjali from CCDC New Delhi. So let me ask you a question. How many of you did not waste food today during your lunch? Please raise your hands. Please kindly raise your hands. Yes, I can see you're active and attending. I don't know how many would have responded if the question was otherwise. People don't like to report food wastage. So I must thank my field team first, who collected this data meticulously and allowing me to stand here This was a project which was conducted under chef study, which is sustainable health environmental food system study, which was funded by Wellcome Trust, and it was done along with India, Africa, and UK. I'm going to present the results from which was a comprehensive food system assessment survey which was conducted in India. It included many sections like consumption, hygiene, food environment, food wastage. I'm going to present about food wastage today. This was done, the analysis was done along with LSHTM team. So as you are aware, food wastage is a global problem. It is the food which is eligible for consumption but what not consumed, and it is closely connected issue with food insecurity, water insecurity, sustainable development goals. It is equally a problem for India, where malnutrition and hunger is rampant, but there are very few studies available on large numbers. It has been unattended. We tried to cover this gap, and we conducted this cross-sectional comprehensive nutrition assessment survey on 5,500 households in north and south of India. In north, it was Sonipat, and down there in south, it was Vizag or Vishakhapatnam. So this data was collected equally on rural and urban households. Sorry for that. We collected information on food sources because it is important from where the food is coming, and it is important from water footprint point of view. We collected information on 25 food groups and asked about food excess. As I said, it is difficult to get information on food wastage. People don't like to report that. So we started with food excess, and there are different definitions which are available about food wastage. Some consider what is not consumed by humans is a waste. Some consider if other treatments are given and what is thrown in the dustbin is a waste. For this analysis, we consider what is thrown in the dustbin as a waste. We, we calculated the water footprint from farm to the plate for differently for both north and south. And let me show how stepwise we went ahead with calculation of the quantity of food wastage and water footprint. So in the step one, as you can see, we collected information on 25 food groups for their raw and cooked food using the food models like bowl or plate or numbers. And then we went, this was done using a frequency questionnaire, and we asked for weekly wastage per household. There was a sub-study which was conducted at the step two, which was using the 24-hour recall. This was done to quantify all the recipes, standardization of recipes, and to calculate the quantity of the food wastage. So as you can see, we firstly in the second step, we got the most frequently consumed foods in north and south regions, in rural and urban separately, under each food group. So for example, when it was cereals, in north, the pulao was preferred, in south, it was boiled rice, like that. Then at the next step, in the third step, as you can see, we did standardize all the recipes separately for rural and urban and north and south, because the culinary practices are different everywhere, and that will affect the ingredients and so the water footprint. In the next step, in the fourth step, we prepared the reference values for water footprint. This was done with help of Dr. Francisca Harris, who did her PhD under Professor Alan Dogger, and she worked on this, along with Professor Rosemary Green, who were experts on this. And you can see it was done separately for rural and urban, and it was for Andhra Pradesh and North separately. Uh, for this, there were the references available that were connected in a way that whatever is available state-wise, then globally, we could connect and we could further calculate the data for each this thing. This slide shows the food excess and wastage. The orange one is excess and red one is wastage, and we can see that it was higher for dals, non-vegetables, and fruits, which are nutrient-dense foods. This slide shows basically the which food, who wasted the food most, and how much did they waste. The proportion and quantity both are important. And as we can see, dals, vegetables, fruits again were wasted by higher proportions, and where vegetables were invested in higher quantity. So further, when we went to water footprint, I presented the results in 6 food groups, and again we can see that the water footprint is higher for Vishakhapatnam, Vizag, than the Sonipat, and it was higher for dals and vegetables. Same we could see for blue and green water footprint, that the quantity as well as water footprint was higher in case of Vizag. So to summarize the results, when we calculated the water footprint, it was almost 71 liters of water wasted per week per household, which could have been saved. We could have reused, there needs to be a strategy for reusing the leftovers as well as for reducing the wastage. We need to increase the consumer awareness. That's what we could find when we were speaking to the consumers regarding which foods can be considered as wastage, hygiene related concern, preparing the food, and so on. And we feel there is need for further qualitative study which could be conducted. There were many questions which we felt need to be attended, related to hygiene, related to what could be the possible implications and what could be the solutions. Overall, food wastage is considered as a crime in culture of India. It is considered as the eternal factor. So we felt we can capture this emotional connect, and it can help to reduce the food wastage. Overall, in comparison with global estimates, the food wastage was lower in India. So we feel that our findings can help other countries to take some information and take it ahead. Thank you very much. I thank all the participants, uh, uh, all of my colleagues and collaborators who has helped me with this. Thank you.
Very much, Anjali, for the presentation. I think the issue of food, so that's actually enough water that should to meet the needs of one person a day that is being wasted on a weekly basis. And if you take that cumulatively over a period of a year, it becomes a significant amount of water that is being lost in the system. So I think when we look at it as a system level, the implications are quite huge. And understanding that we are under climate change, looking at increasing water scarcity, it becomes very urgent to address some of these wastes in the system. Uh, so thank you very much for that presentation. I think we'll move on to the next presentation, which we'll take online. I think our presenter, Hong Yi, is online and ready to present. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Hong Yi Kai. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Human Nutrition and Health in the Wageningen University. Today, the topic of my presentation is achieving healthy, low-cost, and environmentally sustainable diets in China. So today, there is a wide recognition that the global food system is not sustainable anymore. As we know, the food system is responsible for 30% of the global greenhouse gas emission, 70% of the water use, and 1/3 of the land use. In addition, many studies show the association between the NCDs and unhealthy dietary patterns. Therefore, it is necessary to redefine the food system and the dietary pattern from a more comprehensive view that include the environmental and health perspective. As the world's largest producer and consumer, China accounts for around 11% of the world's agricultural greenhouse gas emission, followed by India and the US. According to the FAO, in the 2020, about 60% of the food system greenhouse gas emission of China came from post-production activities. And on the other hand, in China, as well as many other developing countries, along with the rapid economic development, the dietary pattern has been changing in the past few decades. As we can see in this, compared to the Chinese dietary guideline, the fruits, eggs, and especially the dairy were underconsumed for most Chinese adults, while seafood, animal-based food, and oil were overconsumed. So with this background, my research first tried to figure out the changing dietary patterns of the diet quality, diet-related environmental impact, and the cost of diet during the dietary transition in China in the past few decades. Further, to estimate the diet-related environmental impacts, I built a food LSA database that's specific for China. And after that, I tried to identify sustainable diet based on self-select diet of Chinese population, which are healthy, culturally acceptable, affordable, and have minimal environmental impact. And last, I tried to answer the question, does adherence to the Chinese dietary guideline help improve the environmental sustainability of diet? So here is the Chinese food LSA database. By using the literature review, the database collects greenhouse gas emission for 80 food items, water use for 93, and the land use for 50 food items. In order to estimate the environmental impact of the system boundary from production to consumption, the database applied the conversion factors for the processing, storage, packaging, and transportation. So the LSA database can be linked to the survey data of the food consumption to estimate the environmental impact of Chinese diet. Now for the first question, are Chinese diets getting more sustainable? For the result, we can see that the rapid urbanization in China over the past 2 decades has been followed by an improvement in the overall dietary quality. But at the same time, it has been accompanied by the increase in the environmental impact. For example, the greenhouse gas emission increased by 23%, and also the higher cost of the diet. So now we know that the Chinese diet are getting less sustainable. Second, I try to identify the Chinese sustainable diet based on self-select diet by using the reduced rank regression model. And one interesting dietary pattern was identified that I would like to share with you. The dietary pattern display a high consumption of wheat, fruit, and the low consumption of pork and alcohol. So I name it the high wheat and the low pork diet. And what's more, compared to the average diet of Chinese population, the high wheat, low pork diet exhibits a significant reduction in the environmental impacts and also the cost of diet. The diet quality of the high wheat, low pork did not deviate from the average. It means that a shift to the low cost and environmentally sustainable diet while remaining the diet quality is feasible. So this study showed the trade-off exists in the dimension of sustainable diet. So the next research question is, if the Chinese population follow the Chinese dietary guideline, is it possible to improve the sustainability of diet? So from the result, on average, diets with the higher eating index score also had higher diet-related environmental impacts. Okay. As we remember in the introduction before, the consumption of dairy falls below the recommended level. So increasing the consumption of under-consumed fruits, such as dairy products and fruit, partially offset the environmental benefits of reduced meat consumption. Therefore, adhering to the dietary guideline may not result in a reduction of the environmental impacts in my study. So last, here is the take-home message. I would like to highlight that this study provides an understanding of the trade-off and the synergy among the diet quality, dietary costs, and the environmental impact. The results are not to discourage shift towards to a healthier diet, but to urge policymaker and researcher in the public health and agriculture to establish dietary recommendation that integrate health, economics, and environmental goals. So this is my presentation, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
The presentation is the importance of understanding trade-offs and synergies and the risk to the system when decisions that are seemingly good and well-intentioned are made without a consideration of the other sectors, as Hong Yi mentioned in the end. So I think it's something that we are experiencing in a lot of places, especially in the developing world, where key decisions in pursuit of improving and addressing food security and nutrition are accounting for significant land use changes, land use degradation, and creating environmental damage and so forth. So it is very important that as we plan and move ahead in addressing these key challenges of transforming the food system, that there is that understanding of system level trade-offs. In this instance, he gave examples of trade-offs within China, but they can be global, where demand being created elsewhere in the global north is driving production and land use changes in the south. And therefore, the trade-offs are experienced elsewhere. So in one place, they might experience a sustainable food system, but in another place, the trade-offs might be negative. So we need to have that global and systematic understanding of these trade-offs and how we better manage them in the future. Okay, we'll move on to the next online presenter, Romain, who's standing online. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I think you're not seeing the right presentation. Okay, thank you. So I'm Romain Clairoc. I'm a PhD student at LSHTM, and I will talk about biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition in rural Madagascar. So overall, the objectives of my PhD research were to understand how biodiversity loss may cause undernutrition in rural Madagascar and how biodiversity could be managed to improve nutrition. To do that, I used a participatory research with a system approach, and stakeholders were central in the process, especially farmers, village leaders, as well as NGOs, UN agencies, and state agencies from three sectors: biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition. And the research are four components. I think you may not see the last one here, but so the first one was a computer model of a rural landscape, which was developed with stakeholders. Then a broader map of the relationship between biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition at country scale was developed with stakeholders. And from these two components, two promising interventions were identified and explored: collaborative landscape governance and nutrition-sensitive agroforestry. So first, I developed an agent-based model, which was developed to understand the social ecological dynamics between biodiversity loss and undernutrition in rural eastern Madagascar and explore the impact of biodiversity-based interventions there. And the agent-based model was developed based on focus groups and role-playing games with farmers, as well as an expert workshop and feedback from a thematic expert, notably from IASA. So from the focus group and role-playing games, they were conducted to understand landscape dynamics over recent decades in eastern Madagascar and how farmers adapt to a changing environment. In this area, shifting agriculture is the most common practice, and this is what the model explores. But in the focus group, farmers highlighted the impact of biodiversity loss on agricultural productivity via the loss of ecosystem services, such as climate regulation and pest regulation. They also underlined that they used to produce more than what their families needed, but could now only produce enough food for about 3 months on average. They also noted that wild food progressively disappeared, depriving them of an important resilience mechanism during lean season and diet diversification as well. And overall, they reported eating increasingly small portion and having reduced diet diversity. To try to mitigate this diminishing production, farmers had to unsustainably reduce fallow length and overexploit natural resources, despite being aware of their negative consequences. So several dimensions of biodiversity and ecosystem services link biodiversity and nutrition. And they were identified based on existing studies and experts' opinion, and they are represented here. So both biodiversity in forests and in farms both above and below ground, contribute to multiple ecosystem services, which directly support agricultural production and also wild food. And the agent-based model itself showed a social ecological trap, so a vicious cycle of increasing biodiversity loss and undernutrition driven by increasing population density. In that system of shifting agriculture, land scarcity forces farmers to reduce fallow length, which combined with deforestation reduces the vegetation cover and in turn the ecosystem services to agriculture. It also damages soil fertility. This triggers a vicious cycle of environmental degradation that suppresses the productive capacity of the landscape. And due to the central role of land scarcity in that context, the forest conservation scenario in the model had a negative nutritional impact overall when it was not accompanied by improved agricultural practices because it reinforced land scarcity. The agroecological scenario, which includes both agroforestry and home gardens, showed on the other side great synergies between biodiversity and nutrition. And in that context, it relieved land pressure in protected soils and increased and diversified production. So the computer model had a fairly small geographical scope of a specific landscape, and the workshop was then conducted to explore the issues at country level and identify the most promising levers and interventions to improve the system. So 19 experts from these sectors were convened to a workshop and surveyed before and after the workshop. And one key output from the workshop is this extensive map, system map, which identifies the important factors and their relationship. So you can see everything here, and I won't go through the whole map, but I will show you a simplified version that highlights the key dynamic. So on this diagram here, you should still see the key dynamic and factors. They are similar to the conclusion of the agent-based model. However, they include additional factors that are not in the model. In addition to population growth, you have economic factors, governance, infrastructure, and traditional norms that also contribute to driving the vicious cycle of biodiversity loss and undernutrition. And you also have the individual impoverishment that keep people locked in, that prevent them from adopting better practices. So overall, experts from the three sectors agreed that biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition were interdependent. However, the discussions highlighted that these interdependencies could generate either lose-lose, lose-win, or win-win outcomes, and that integrated strategies were necessary to ensure synergies. Nevertheless, the stakeholders that took part in the workshop tended to believe that biodiversity conservation would generally bring agricultural and nutritional benefits, something which diverges from other results. So here you see the main levers and interventions that were identified, and there was a large consensus that improving governance and the rule of law was a priority. Also, improving individual capacity was considered important by almost everyone, both important and feasible. And there were a lot of interventions that were identified as important, but the key point was that stakeholders felt that the key thing was to combine them in an integrated and participatory approach that considers whole landscapes. And to achieve that, it was considered necessary for the three sectors to develop joint strategies and collaborate in joint projects and meaningfully involve local farmers. So, as integrated and participatory governance was identified as important, I sought to explore the current practices in Madagascar. So I conducted semi-structured interviews with 16 key informants from state officials, NGO and UN experts, farmers, and community leaders to understand their perception and experience. And I focused on the interplay of customary and formal institutions, that is, the rules and the decision-making mechanisms that are relevant to landscape governance. And the interviews revealed that customary rules and authorities retain an important role in practice in rural landscapes, but that they were partially incompatible with state institutions, that is, with the law. Customarily, anyone is free to use forest resources, or at least most forest patches, and that's an important customary way to acquire rights to land. This is in direct contradiction with country laws, which make state forest a state property and reveals a conflict over forest control. Regarding sources of authority, customarily, elder male leaders, village leaders, play a central role in village governance, and that remains true in many rural areas. But the law makes no reference to them. On the contrary, village assemblies, which gather all adults of the village, appear in the law, but likely have a mostly informative role in many rural areas. So external projects relying purely on village assemblies and aiming to restrict forest use may face resistance and ultimately fail. And the interviews also highlighted the large trust deficits between farmers and the state, possibly stemming from this conflict over forest control and sources of authority, which can severely impede collaborative governance. So collaborative governance faces many challenges in practice, and the study suggests, I think, that power relations between actors would need to be properly addressed to achieve any meaningful collaboration between them. Finally, agroforestry was identified as important both in the model and in the workshop. And the last study aimed to design an agroforestry intervention which could provide priority micronutrients over the year. So vitamin A, C, folate, iron, zinc, and calcium were identified as priority micronutrients, and lipids were also included. First, a long list of crops was identified from the literature and discussion with local agronomists, and 2 focus groups were then conducted to develop a portfolio. Farmers from the 2 focus groups selected 24 crops in total, a portfolio which would ensure good availability of all priority micronutrients, assuming some complementary traits between farmers. However, we still see some seasonal patterns, and so improving fruits conservation could further reduce them and improve year-long availability. Overall, women choose a much more diverse portfolio than men. Women were also more interested in the nutritional value of crops and were much more likely to adopt new crops such as sesame, chia seeds, and moringa when told about their nutritional benefits. Women also reported that in their actual farms, decisions were made jointly with their husband, and so involving women could facilitate the adoption of this approach. Overall, participants showed great interest in the intervention and reported few barriers. The main limitation were access to planting material and financial constraints. So as a conclusion, I think that overall this research provides some suggestion as to how and why biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition are interdependent in Madagascar. And it suggests that Madagascar may be caught in a vicious cycle, worsening biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition outcomes, but also some ways that this trend could be reversed. It cautions, however, that synergies between the 3 sectors are not automatic and that integrated intervention that consider 3 outcomes are necessary to ensure synergies. And collaborative governance appears important, but faces significant challenges in practice, so it's clearly not a panacea. The nutrition-sensitive agroforestry approach explored here, on the other hand, is less ambitious, but it may more easily provide positive outcomes. Finally, I would like to thank all the partners that contributed to that research, and especially the local organization and people, the CNRE, the NGO L'Homme et l'Environnement, and CETAMADA. Thank you very much for listening.
I think there's a key theme that is into and synergies. Again, in this particular example of this talk, it was the key linkages between biodiversity, agriculture, and nutrition, and the accompanying loss in terms of system resilience that has occurred due to a loss of biodiversity in many systems. And in the global south, this is particularly critical for smallholder farmers whose resilience is traditionally dependent on that level of biodiversity and functional ecosystems that provide a range of services. And I think the conversation on integrated landscape management approaches and agroecological transitions that support and strengthen the role of biodiversity. It's an important conversation that we need to keep in the back of our minds. I know there are a lot of communities of practice and projects that are being implemented that are really testing some of these theories and ideas around agroecological transitions in agriculture. So perhaps we can pick up on that in the discussions. For now, we'll move on to our next speaker, who again should be online. And it's Celia. Celia, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you're having a nice time in Malawi. I'm going to explain to you the research that I have been doing during the second year of my PhD. I wanted to actually check which are the perceived double and triple duty potential of different policies that governments can implement. And to do that, I started by conducting a scoping review, and afterwards we did some surveys and international workshops. So, well, all of my colleagues before me already explained what the issue is around food systems, how food loss and waste has an impact both on human and planetary health. So you already know that, and how everything is interlinked. So everything that happens from farm to fork as well, how it's having an impact in both our health and the planet. So that's actually also the topic that I started to focus on my research. I wanted to see which are the effects of different policies that have been implemented by governments, not only in obesity and non-communicable diseases, but also in food insecurity and in nutrition-related inequalities, both from a social perspective and also from a gender perspective. And also we wanted to see what's the impact on climate change and biodiversity loss from different areas, and to include all of this together, because that's what policymakers need to do when they have to make decisions. So the main research question that I had from a very, very big perspective was, what can governments do in order to tackle the problem and act upon the food systems to make them more healthier and sustainable? And I started by compiling different recommendations addressed to governments. So as you can see, there have been many reports published in the last years. They started mainly in 2019, also with the Eat Lancet report, but even before, there were some interesting reports that were giving guidelines or also policy recommendations for governments, not only for food, towards healthy diets, but also for environmental sustainability, like the IPCC reports, and also for aspects related more to vulnerable groups, such as UNICEF. So we gather all of these policy recommendations together as a first step, and we took a total of 23, and we gathered more than actually 290 recommendations, and we divided them by categories. So from food production and agriculture to everything related to the aspects of storage, processing, packaging, and distribution, also food loss and waste, also how trade and investment agreements have an impact, and then everything related to the food environment, from food composition, labeling, marketing, provision, retail, and the prices of food. We gathered all of these recommendations, and the word that were about exactly the same thing, we merged them, and then we've proposed a list of policies that governments can implement globally. So global governments, how they can act within their countries or regions or even cities, depending on the level of jurisdiction, and what can they do to improve the food system. We gathered all of these policies, and then we proposed ones that were taking into account both the health and the environment. And this, you can see some example. This one is related, for instance, to agriculture. Another one related to marketing and exposure in retail outlets, or also about zoning laws and where are the healthier and unhealthier outlets placed in the cities or the towns. However, we proposed a total of 46. And then what we wanted to do with that was to identify which one of the policies that we were proposing actually had double or triple duty potential, which was either to have a positive effect in 2 of the primary outcomes that are undernutrition, obesity, or environmental sustainability, or in 3 of them, ideally. We also wanted to see which factors or which impacts they had in inequalities and in women's empowerment, but the main goal was to mainly check nutrition and environmental sustainability. So we started by actually running a survey among international experts in the field from agriculture, environmental sustainability, trade, economics, health. We wanted to see which was, according to them, the effect and the effectiveness of these policies. So if the effect that this policy will have, for instance, in climate change was, according to them, positive or neutral or even negative. And when they will select that the effect was positive, they also had to say which was the level of effectiveness. So if that policy, once implemented, it will be very effective or only a little bit effective. And that was the starting point. We did that. And then afterwards, once we had collected the results, we organized different workshops from experts around the world. We wanted to ensure that many countries with different levels of jurisdiction and also different contexts participated. So that's why we did it in Europe and in Latin America and also in East and West Africa. And we invited the experts so that they could interact together and discuss the different synergies and also trade-offs and effects that they thought they were the policies that we were proposing will have. Also based on their experiences, because as you know, Latin America has implemented, for instance, a lot of policies related to the food environments, like very good and effective labels, whereas in Europe we still don't have that, even we are discussing about the Nutri-Score. And then in East Africa, they have implemented a lot of interesting strategies around sustainable agriculture. So we wanted to put all of this knowledge together and to discuss the potential synergies and trade-offs and reach a common goal. So this was done in English, in Spanish, and in French, the workshops. And then we analyzed all of the results together. And we recorded all of the answers. So what we actually did was that we were able to identify which was the effectiveness level. And whenever there was a policy that was, for instance, this one that I'm showing in the screen, very effective for undernutrition and obesity and non-communicable diseases and also inequalities and women's empowerment, it could have actually some potential trade-offs. So during the workshops, we also discussed the trade-offs that the policies may have in order to make sure that we could address them to propose better policies for governments. And what we found also very interesting is that thanks to the survey and the workshops, we were able to identify which are the policies among the 44 that we were proposing, the ones that were considered to be more effective. And there were things related to land use management and support to farmers, and crop diversification, of course. And then from food environments, we were talking about school food programs and fiscal measures such as subsidies or a reduction of VAT, but also marketing restrictions and affordability of healthy diets. And thanks to the 96 experts that participated in the workshops that we organized, we were able to then gather all of the information together and rephrase the policies to propose a final list of 44. And after that, we also asked experts to rank them according to what they thought was their prioritization level. And we were able to divide the policies in which ones should governments prioritize first if they want to have a strong impact, both for the food systems, tackling undernutrition, obesity, and environmental sustainability. And we divided them between the ones that were more related to food supply chain. So everything that is from agriculture to transport, processing, packaging, and also food loss. And then everything that is more related to the food environment on what has an impact on consumers' choice. So these are the top 10 out of the 44 policies that we are actually recommending. So based on the previous studies that we did that I didn't discuss today because this was already a lot, because we also did a scoping review in which we were checking which have been the effectiveness and the effects of policies that have been already implemented around the world. We then did this study to actually propose a final list, also making sure that we understand which are the lessons that we have learned from implementing those policies around the world. And as you know, there are still so many policies that need to be implemented, but and about areas that we have not touched upon until right now, like for instance, food loss and waste, that we wanted to make sure that stakeholders had also a voice and that they can tell us what we can learn from the different synergies and trade-offs. So we proposed this final list of 44 policies, and all of them have double and triple duty potential that policymakers should implement. So that's mainly my take-off message. However, I also want to say that the results from the scoping review are out. They have been published in a journal. So, and this one is also in a paper right now at the moment. So if you have questions related to this and to potential synergies and trade-offs for specific policies that you're interested in, you can always contact me.
The positive impact that policy can have in terms of supporting food systems, transitions and transformations. And I think a lot of us who are gathered in here today, we are researchers, and our role is mostly in the evidence generation and translation to inform some of these good practice policies. And I think when we get to the discussion, one of the things that I want us to touch on is how can we then translate these good practice policies or the good intentions in policies into actual practice on the ground? Because there seems to always be a disconnect then that we can get the evidence to bear in terms of the actual policy, but to change the landscape in terms of what is being done on the ground, it's always a different story. And in Africa, we always say, governments that, we've got the best policies in the world, we've got the best this. But someone then said, in a talk somewhere, that it's not actually the best policy if it is not delivering results on the ground. So I think in the discussions, if we can just touch on some of those aspects as well. So we'll move on to our next presenter, who is here in person, Claudia. If you may please take the stage. 10 minutes. We've got our timekeeper sitting over there. She'll let you know when you've got 5 minutes and when you've run out of time.
Great. Thank you, Tapaza. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Claudia Offner. I'm a research assistant at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And today I'll be presenting on measuring seasonal flood exposures for dietary diversity outcomes over time during a nutrition-sensitive agriculture intervention, using Bangladesh as a case study. So we do know that climate change is expected to significantly increase the frequency and severity of global flooding events, particularly in Asia. There is a call for nutrition-sensitive adaptation strategies to mitigate the adverse health outcomes from repeated exposure to flood events. However, there is little research on the long-term effects of flooding, since longitudinal flood metrics are in their infancy and high-frequency health data sets are limited. Now, flooding as a phenomena is not as black and white as we think. Yes, there are adverse outcomes, but as you can see from this crop calendar for the Sylhet region, actually flooding is a very integral part of the food production system. And in some seasons, like the monsoon seasons, crops actually need flooding to produce properly, whereas other seasons flooding would be quite harmful. So what we actually see in reality is that the magnitude of flooding is important, but we also need to be considering seasonal onset and human experience when we're actually analyzing our data. So the data challenge, well, on the one hand, we have satellite data from the environmental and climate change science disciplines, which is an excellent publicly available resource that has high spatial resolution data, so we can get data at very localized areas. That's collected at regular intervals over time and is global coverage. So this can be applied in a variety of different contexts. Of course, the downside is we don't have human experiential data, which is why survey data is absolutely essential to capturing the actual impacts at the population level. And this is the kind of data we use a lot in the ANH nexus. Now, as many of you know, this process tends to be quite expensive and time-consuming, so there tend to be trade-offs in how much coverage we have. So you might have a small sample size in a small part of the country, or if it's nationally representative, it's still a small sample size in the grand scheme of things. But most importantly, we're not actually capturing seasonality with our baseline end lines and maybe midlines. They tend to be at annual collected annually. So when you bring this all together, how can we address this gap? In our project, we aimed to establish a longitudinal method for extracting flooding over time and validating it against flood surveys. We wanted to go further and evaluate the role of a nutrition-sensitive agriculture intervention to assess the relationship between seasonal flooding and dietary diversity. And ultimately, we wanted to highlight the importance of seasonality in this kind of research and linking these phenomena. So we use data from the Food and Agriculture Approaches to Reducing Malnutrition trial. This was an RCT conducted in the northeastern part of Bangladesh. And they ran a homestead food production intervention involving 2,700 women across 96 village clusters. This was conducted over a 4-year period between 2015 and 2019. And while they had baseline, midline, endline, they also had a really excellent surveillance system. So for us, this was a key reason for selecting this data set because we had 8 panels of dietary diversity data, which we could actually analyze as a time series adjacent to our blood metric that we developed. And in addition to this, they had collected data for a very impactful flood in 2017, which we could use to cross-validate our method. So the method itself, for those of you who aren't familiar with flood data, when you're creating a flood map, you're essentially taking an image from before a known event and after a known event, differencing it to see what the actual impact is. But when you want to look at this over time, that's not possible. So we selected images from a very, like a known dry period with the least amount of variation and basically created them into a composite image that we could then take as a reference point and difference with other satellite images to create a time series. We then validated this against a different satellite data type. So we initially used radar data and we validated it against multispectral data. And we found that our metric was performing at 82%, which is very good. We then went further, tested this against the flood experience data, and also found that it was highly associated with human flood experience. So when we came to the modeling, it was a rather complicated process, and we did control for a variety of variables. But the main thing I want to draw to your attention here is that we were looking at the percentage of clusters flooding as our exposure, and women's dietary diversity score as a continuous score was our outcome. And we have a lag for the cluster, the flooding exposure. And so when you look at our estimates in a little bit, you'll see that flooding, it's essentially flooding impacts subsequent dietary diversity 2 months later. Just to summarize our models, we were using Bayesian models and we have ran 4 models, and I'll show you how we built them up so it doesn't get too complicated. All of these models had fixed effect terms for each woman and a random spatial temporal term to control for autocorrelation, which is essentially the way in which the data relates to itself. So first model was just how, I went forward. That's okay. The first model examines the overall effect of flooding on subsequent dietary diversity. Model 2 does the same, but then breaks it down by the treatment. Model 3 then looks at seasonal effects without treatment, and Model 4 is our 3-way interaction, which looks at seasonal effect of flooding on dietary diversity by treatment. But when we look at this, this is with all of our controls. We're not going to focus on the controls due to time constraints, but they were constant for all of our models. We are essentially going to be focusing on our primary outcomes and exposures. And so here in Model 1, we have the overall effects of flooding without a seasonal interaction or a treatment interaction. And here we can see the seasonal effects of dietary diversity on their own. But I want to really draw attention to flood extents here, which isn't particularly impactful. Treatment is impactful, and it does have a protective effect on dietary diversity. And this is something that this effect size we see here has been replicated in other analyses from this trial. So we're confident in this. Now, when we add to the model and look at flooding by treatment group, we're not actually seeing a huge difference between the treatment groups. And this is because we're looking at flooding as an annual average rather than a seasonal one. Moving on to Model 3, where we're actually looking at the seasonal effects of flooding and how that impacts dietary diversity, you see that the picture changes. And actually, flooding that happens in March and April, it has a detrimental impact on dietary diversity, whereas the other months seem to be beneficial. And if you look back at our crop calendar, you'll see that makes sense because in May, June, July, August, we actually need flooding in order to have enough crop production. Whereas in March, April, if you have a high magnitude flood in this time, it's not going to have a positive impact. So in our final model, we essentially took the interaction between season, flooding, and treatment group. And when we look at the seasonal relationship by treatment, we see the same pattern we saw initially, but instead the treatment group is showing a protective effect on dietary diversity during flooding, but only in the March and April month. So to conclude, the effects of flooding on dietary diversity in rural Bangladesh are detrimental in the months of March and April, but they can be beneficial in the months of May and June. NSA interventions may offset these detrimental effects, but seasonality is crucial in actually understanding these long-term implications. And so looking forward, we do think that pathways to improving long-term dietary diversity post-flooding are still not understood and may play key roles in adaptation strategy development. High-frequency health data will be essential in capturing these effects and for planning long-term effects of climate change. And finally, kind of linking back to what Tavadswa said earlier on pushing the boundaries of knowledge, yes, advances in technology offer many opportunities, but we need more interdisciplinary collaboration to actually harness the full potential of these technologies in global health research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. One thing I like about research that moves outside of the boundaries is it gets us thinking differently. Normally, when we think of floods, we think infrastructure, damage to infrastructure, property, and those sort of things. I've been interviewed, I think this year, more than 10 times around issues of flooding that affected Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. And just the day when I arrived, it was flooding in KwaZulu-Natal, and the first thing I had to do after landing was to get on a TV interview to talk about the impacts of flooding. And I'll be honest, in all those conversations, we've never talked about linking floods to food security and nutrition, especially looking at women and children and what the implications are, and if there could be any positive spin-offs associated with floods. Of course, in this region, floods are annualized because we've got a unimodal rainfall season, but we've never really thought in that direction. We've always looked at the one direction, which is infrastructure, property, lives, and loss and food insecurity. So it's very interesting when studies like this, they bring new thinking and they force us to look in a different direction. So I will come to you with a question in the discussion around how we can, replicate or duplicate such studies in regions like here in Southern Africa, where we are experiencing an increased frequency and intensity of floods, and they're also happening out of the normal rainfall season. So we are seeing a lot of them happening towards, especially during the autumn season and not during our summer rainfall season. So we are now experiencing floods in autumn and in winter, ironically. So yeah, thanks for that very interesting presentation. We'll move on to our last in-person speaker, and that would be Elena Martinez. She's going to talk to us about retail food prices and food attributes.
Okay. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Martinez. I'm a PhD candidate at Tufts University in Boston, and I'm going to be presenting some of my research today linking retail food prices with environmental impacts and the nutritional profile of foods. This research is part of the Food Prices for Nutrition project, and I'd like to thank my co-authors here, Nicole Blackstone, Park Wilde, and Will Masters. So we know that food systems and what we eat have really big impacts both on our health as humans and on the environment. We've heard this from our panelists today and at other times during the conference. And to reduce these impacts, we're going to need action on a lot of fronts. And we hear a lot of talk about shifting towards healthier, more environmentally sustainable diets. But changing what people eat is really, really difficult. And one of the reasons for that is that there are many things that influence our food choices. And price and environmental sustainability environmental sustainability and nutrition are not always at the top of people's lists. And price is one major driver of food choice. We know that many, many people around the world can't afford a healthy diet. And if we know that many people can't afford a healthy diet, can we also expect them to consider environmental sustainability when they're choosing what to eat? And we also hear this popular narrative that shifts towards healthier, more sustainable diets are going to be really expensive for consumers. But when we dig a bit into the literature, we see that there's a small but growing body of research showing that healthier, more environmentally sustainable diets can be less expensive in some contexts. A lot of this evidence comes from modeling studies of theoretical dietary patterns or the estimates of environmental impacts of observed diets in certain countries. But theoretical dietary patterns don't necessarily reflect what people are actually eating, and they don't necessarily reflect what's available in retail food environments globally. So in this study, we started with retail food prices and linked them with information on the environmental impacts and nutritional quality of foods to look at this relationship. So we start with data from the World Bank International Comparison Program. This is a set of retail food prices for over 700 comparable food items from 181 countries. And we used the data sets from 2011 and 2017. We linked this set of retail food items to estimates of the greenhouse gas emissions and water footprint of food items. We used this recently published database by another research team. And then we also estimated the nutritional quality of each of the food items. Here we use the Food Compass score, which is a nutrient profiling system that assesses the nutritional quality of foods over 9 domains. So first I'll start by looking at a little bit on each of these domains, comparing between food groups. And when we do this, what we see, if you're familiar with this field, kind of confirms what we see in past literature. So here we have greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis across food groups. So we see what we already know: animal source foods have higher greenhouse gas emissions compared to other food groups. Then we can look at water footprint, and we see that animal source foods, fruits, vegetables, and legumes, nuts, and seeds have higher water footprint compared to other food groups, and also much larger variation in water footprint among the food group. When we look at the nutrient profile of foods, we see fruits, vegetables, and legumes, nuts, and seeds have higher nutrient profile than other food groups. But when we look at the range of foods available within each food group, we see there are relatively nutritious options available in most food groups. And then just taking a look at price per kilocalorie, we see that yes, fruits, vegetables, and animal source foods are more expensive per kilocalorie than other food groups. But again, looking at the ranges available in retail food outlets globally, we see that there are less expensive options in every food group. So next, start digging into some of the within group variation, we looked at associations between price and greenhouse gas emissions, water footprint, and nutrient profile, and stratified these models by food group. So we'll look at some of the results. Okay, so here we're looking at coefficient plots showing the results of all of these regressions. So in the left-hand panel, we see regressions of greenhouse gas emissions on price, in the middle, water footprint, and on the right, nutrient profile. And in general, we see that price per kilocalorie is positively associated with greenhouse gas emissions, water footprint, and nutrient profile. So in other words, foods that are more expensive per kilocalorie tend to have higher greenhouse gas emissions, higher water footprint, and are more healthful. And the magnitude of this association is largest among animal source foods, but there are other food groups where this association is also strong. So we can break down some of this information by looking at some line graphs. So here we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis per kilocalorie, and on the x-axis, deciles of price per kilocalorie. So on the left are the cheapest options in each of the food groups, and on the right are the most expensive options, and each food group is in a different color. So again, we generally see that more expensive foods tend to have higher emissions, and this is true in a lot of different food groups, except for in starchy staples and fruits. And we see the strongest associations among animal source foods and vegetables, that's the red line and the green line, where the most expensive options in those food groups have greenhouse gas emissions more than double the least expensive options of it. So we can see that with some of these arrows. So we can look at the same thing for water footprint. So again, we see that more expensive foods also have higher water footprint, and this is true in most food groups, except for among starchy staples. And if we focus in on the nutrient-rich food groups, these food groups, the animal source foods in red, legumes, nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, tend to have higher average water footprint, much more variation in water footprint between food items available in the same food group, and also a stronger association between water footprint and price. And then we can also look at the same type of relationship for nutrient profile. So here we have food compass score on the y-axis by deciles of food price. And we see that on average, more expensive foods are more healthful, except for among oils and fats, but there's a lot of variation between food groups when we look at this relationship. So for example, on the top, you see the vegetables, fruits, and legumes, nuts, and seeds. And at all price points, we see that these have the highest nutrient profile. But for some of our other food groups, we see that there's a positive relationship between price and nutrient profile. So more expensive animal source foods, starchy staples, and sugar, sweets, and candies are more healthful. But for oils and fats, we see that actually more expensive options are a bit less nutritious, according to the food compass score. So there's a lot of results in here, and I've shared just some of them with you, but I think the biggest message here is that more expensive foods do tend to be more healthful, but they also have higher environmental impacts per kilocalorie on average. But when we look within food groups, we see that there are healthful, inexpensive options in each food group, and these tend to have lower environmental impacts. And so when we talk about shifting towards healthier, more environmentally sustainable diets, we are often discussing incentivizing dietary shifts between food groups. But I would say some of these data point to the fact that we could also try to incentivize shifts within food groups. So we could try to lower environmental impacts of healthy diets somewhat by focusing on shifts to less expensive, lower impact foods within each food group. But I'll leave you with one thought. It took me a really long time as a researcher to put together this information, and it's almost impossible for consumers to know the health attributes of foods, much less the environmental attributes. So I think we really do need comprehensive, interpretable food labels to communicate this information to consumers. And databases like the one we put together for this study could be helpful in informing labeling systems like that. So thanks so much, and I look forward to questions.
So with that bit, I'll give the panel 60 seconds each to say some final concluding remarks. And I think we'll go in the same order as we did our presentations. So we'll start off with Anjali.
So I would say that there is relatively less data on food wastage, and it has not been yet connected with environmental things, and we need more information along with quantitative, also the qualitative information, because we need some local level solutions to come up with. And we also need some action on policies when we are handling food wastage. There is a chance to recover food as well as water and reduce the environmental footprint on that. So I'll end on that note, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Hongyi?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, according to my presentation, I would like to highlight that my study provides an understanding of the trade-off and the synergy among the sustainable indicators in the Chinese diet that I hope to give an example for the low-income country in the world. But my result is not to urge people do not follow the health diet, but to urge the researcher and also a lot of us in the public health, nutrition, to establish dietary recommendation that integrate health and economics and meets environmental goals. Thank you. Sorry, I just hear my voice.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just hear my voice.
It's okay. I think we heard you clearly in the room. Thank you very much for those concluding remarks. Next is Romain.
Yeah, I'd like to. I think the key point of my study is that I think it matters for agriculture and nutrition sector to reach out to the conservation sector, because what they do may have a direct impact on nutritional outcomes, and they are increasingly involved in rural development projects that may directly touch on changing agricultural practices or nutritional practices. And so it is important to actually measure the outcome of these projects and to maybe orient them toward goals that have improved nutritional outcomes. So that would be a recommendation both to actors and to researchers, maybe to evaluate their actions and see what kind of synergies could be created.
Thank you very much, Romain. Celia.
The key message will be, in my case, that there are different type of policies that can be implemented, and many that have been implemented in different countries of the world that can teach us something that we still don't know, because the industry is going to try to make sure that, for instance, labeling is not as effective, and a label is only as powerful as we can make it. So I will just try to say to learn lessons from different stakeholders and to make sure that all of the policies that are implemented are actually working, so that instead of going towards modifying them to what the industry wants, but to make sure that they are more effective. So to listen to the stakeholders that are involved in the whole process, and not just from the health or the environmental perspective, but putting everyone in the same room.
Thank you very much, Celia. And then I'll come to our two panelists in the room, Claudia and then Elena.
Thank you. So my concluding remarks for flooding and dietary diversity, I would just like to say that flooding, there has been a lot of research on this, looking at the short-term effects of floods and flood events on food security, but that it has been actually that the methods for capturing flooding over time are still in their infancy. And it's going to take a lot more data and high frequency data and interdisciplinary collaborations for us to actually push forward this field and have a better idea and sense for what flooding, compound and repeat exposures to floods, how that's going to affect food security variables down the line. Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
So I was reflecting a bit on our chair saying that we should sit at the boundary of our knowledge and our field. And I think when I think about the research I presented today, I really think about, we say here that we're doing interdisciplinary research, but I think we can continue to challenge ourselves to sit at the boundary of those disciplines and cross the boundary. For my research in particular, we would need much more interaction with the environmental science community if we want life cycle assessments on the crops we're interested in, the animals we're interested in, and the geographic regions we're interested in, and really kind of communication between nutritionists, agriculturalists, and that community to get the information we need. And then I also think about kind of the boundaries of our own comfort. I think the last question from this side of the room about popularity and palatability of some of these really nutritious, cheap foods is really, really relevant. As I've been doing this research, one thing I've challenged myself to do is eat some of these foods that I write about. So I've been having dinner once a week or twice a month where I have tinned mackerel or canned sardines in tomato sauce, which if you know the ICP food list, they're on there. And sometimes I really like them, and sometimes I really just can't even finish the tin. And so it really makes me think about, like, how do we drive demand for some of these foods that we keep telling people that they should eat? So thanks.
Very much. I think that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you very much.